The rapidly growing global human population has many causes for concern. With more humans comes a higher need for resources such as space, food, clean water, and fuel. The need for space has led to habitat destruction and crowding out of other species, driving many to become endangered or extinct. Many areas of the world cannot grow adequate food to maintain their population size and do not have access to clean water, leading to starvation and disease. Non-renewable energy sources like oil will one day run out unless we find alternative energy sources. Biotic potential is the maximum rate at which a population can increase under ideal conditions, which allow the highest possible birth rate and lowest possible death rate. However, this biotic potential is often limited by environmental resistance, which is a limit on the growth potential of a population that comes from both the living and non-living environments to decrease birth rates and/or increase death rates. Examples of environmental resistance include availability of food and space, interaction with predators, and natural catastrophes such as floods and droughts. Over time, the average size of most populations remains steady, but populations may grow and shrink in cycles known as boom and bust cycles, in which rapid population growth is followed by a massive die-off. This often corresponds with the changing seasons. A local example is in the Chicagoland area, which is a temperate climate, meaning that it gets warmer in the spring and summer and cooler in the fall and winter. This leads to insect and bird populations growing rapidly during the warmer months and dying off during the colder months. Cycle times may be longer than the seasons, however. Another local example are cicadas in the Chicago region. Every so many years, cicadas emerge from where they've been living under the soil, and we get a so-called cicada outbreak. But as quickly as they appear, they seem to die off, and we don't see them for several years again. This graph represents boom and bust cycles of human baby birth in the United Kingdom over several decades. Notice the so-called baby boomer generation, born during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This phrase, baby boom, refers to a noticeable increase in the birth rate during these decades. This was followed by a marked decrease in birth rates during the 70s and 80s, and then a moderate increase afterwards with some fluctuation from there on out. This graph represents seasonal boom and bust cycles, in which annual seasonal cycles of organisms in temperate climates die off in the winter and spike in population during the spring. Most species will experience annual population highs and lows based on the seasons. The winter season is when food and water become most limiting. The end of the breeding season is when populations tend to peak sometime during the spring. Finally, this graph represents long-term boom and bust cycles, in this case for the snowshoe hare. A hare is similar to a rabbit, and in this case the term snowshoe comes from the fact that these hares have large feet that allow them to easily navigate snow in the winter. This is important since they are primarily found in the northern United States and Canada, where the ground is covered with snow for many months out of the year. So in this case, the population displays regular cycles over a number of years. Trapping records suggest that the snowshoe hare has 10-year cycles. Notice that approximately every 10 years the population spikes, followed by a marked decrease, with another spike about 10 years later. A population may also grow rapidly if population controlling factors change. For example, if predators that normally eat an organism are removed, or the food supply that an organism eats is markedly increased, the population of that organism can grow dramatically. Population growth is also rapid when individuals move to a new habitat that has abundant resources and few competitors for those resources, along with no predators that feed on the new organism that has moved into the area. This is an example of an exotic species in which a foreign species invades a habitat where it does not normally live. This is often at the hands of humans. A local example in which humans introduced a new species into an ecosystem is the Asian carp that's found in the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. Asian carp were originally imported from Southeast Asia to the southern United States to help wastewater treatment facilities keep retention ponds clean. The problem is those ponds flooded, and this allowed the Asian carp to escape into nearby rivers, where they compete with native fish for food sources, therefore killing many of the local fish populations. Populations that grow rapidly eventually stabilize in number or crash, meaning that the numbers decrease rapidly. This is due to the carrying capacity, which is the maximum population of a particular species that an ecosystem can support. While a population may temporarily grow larger than its carrying capacity, an overshoot of this capacity will be followed by a decrease in population size until the resources are able to recover. If the overshoot is too high, the resources may be unable to recover, and the population size will be limited permanently. As discussed at the beginning of this presentation, there is much concern over the carrying capacity for the human population on Earth. If the human population grows too rapidly and resources are depleted, will this rapid population growth be followed by a crash in which human population size is permanently lowered? This represents the effect of carrying capacity on the growth rate of a population. While the population grows rapidly at first, its growth slows as the population size approaches its carrying capacity. Once the population is at or near the capacity, it stops growing and its numbers stabilize. Populations can overshoot carrying capacity, but only for a limited time, and may permanently decrease the resources available, along with the number of organisms that the environment can support. Here we see that unrestricted deer population growth may diminish a habitat's carrying capacity. There is a sharp spike in deer population size, which is followed by a marked decrease in the population size. This is due to the large number of deer feeding on trees and shrubs, which causes habitat damage. The carrying capacity is reduced from this habitat damage because there is not as much food for the deer to feed on. Due to the lower amount of food, this also leads to a permanent decrease in the population size of the deer. There are two broad categories of factors that maintain populations around the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. These are density-independent factors and density-dependent factors. Density-independent factors limit population size regardless of the population density, which refers to the number of individuals in a certain area. Density-dependent factors increase in effectiveness as population density increases. We will discuss specific examples of both of these types of factors on the upcoming slides. Examples of density-independent factors include natural disasters, weather conditions, and human activities. Natural disasters such as hurricanes, droughts, floods, and fires reduce population sizes regardless of density. For instance, it doesn't matter whether there are 10 or 1,000 organisms from a population in a forest. If a fire sweeps through the forest, all of those organisms will be killed equally. Weather conditions play a role in how long populations are able to survive. A local example is in Chicago, where the insect and plant populations reduced rapidly after the first frost. Once again, it doesn't matter how many of these insects and plants are present, they are all going to die equally. Lastly, habitat destruction by humans reduces populations. For example, if a certain number of acres of a rainforest is destroyed, it doesn't matter how many organisms are present within certain populations. Once again, they are all going to be destroyed equally. Examples of density-dependent factors include predation and parasitism. During predation, one organism called the predator feeds on another organism called the prey. Examples of predation include wolves killing and eating bison, or deers grazing on the buds of a maple tree. The higher the number of bison there are in an area, the more effective that wolves are at keeping the bison at their carrying capacity, because it will become easier and easier for wolves to find the bison. Parasitism is a type of predation in which a parasite predator lives on or inside a host organism and feeds on the host. As organisms become more dense, the effectiveness of parasitism rises because parasites are able to move from host organism to host organism, spreading through a population and once again decreasing their number to keep it around the carrying capacity. In this density-dependent factor example of predation, gray wolves are acting as predators to an American bison prey. Therefore, the bison population cannot rise too rapidly because as their numbers increase, the wolves are able to find them more easily to eat, thereby limiting bison numbers to their carrying capacity. Let's explore the density-dependent factor of predation a little further to understand how its effectiveness increases as the number of organisms in a certain area also increase. Let's say there's a certain prey population, number 1, that's able to grow because it's not being fed upon by a predator. Once the numbers reach a certain height, they become easy to find for the predator, so the predator begins to feed on prey population number 1, causing the prey population to go down and the predator population to go up. At this point in time, if there's more predators than prey, the predator is going to either die off from lack of food or is going to switch to eating a more abundant food source, such as prey population number 2. Therefore, prey population number 2 starts going down, and overall the predator population remains steady, right around the carrying capacity. This also allows prey population number 1 to increase, such that the predator switches back to eating prey population number 1 after it grows in numbers. Hopefully in this example, you can see that both prey populations and the predator population are kept right around the carrying capacity based on the feeding habits of the predator on the different prey. As we just discussed, natural predator-prey feeding relationships keep the densities of both populations fairly steady. However, when a species is introduced into a habitat where it doesn't normally live, it often experiences a rapid population growth due to the presence of abundant prey for it to eat, or having no natural predators that feed upon it, or no natural competitors that compete with it for resources such as food and space. This is known as an invasive species. We can discuss invasive species from the predator or prey standpoint. When a new predator is introduced into an area, prey populations may be wiped out because there is now a new predator feeding on them. An example is that the mongoose from India was introduced into Hawaii as a way to exterminate rat populations found on sugarcane farms. The problem is they also ended up exterminating native bird populations. When a new prey population is introduced into an area with no natural predators to feed upon it, the prey population can grow uncontrollably. An example of this would be the prickly pear cactus that was introduced into Australia from Latin America for agricultural purposes. And because there's no natural predator of the prickly pear cactus in Australia, it rapidly spread through the country. The mongoose, imported from India to prey on rats, threatens native ground nesting birds in Hawaii. The density-dependent factor of parasitism becomes more effective when the host population has a high density because the parasites are able to spread more readily between hosts when they are closer together. A common example is in schools or daycares. If a child comes to school with a cold, very often that cold is going to be caught by many of their classmates, along with perhaps some of the teachers on campus. This is because the teachers, along with the children, have very close interaction with one another. Parasite infestation may reduce a population size by killing a host directly, or by making individuals sick and leaving them more susceptible to predation. Parasites include bacteria, viruses, and fungi. Competition takes place when organisms within the same species or from different species must fight for limited resources. Intraspecific competition, which refers to organisms within the same species, is more intense than interspecific competition, which refers to competition between members of different species, because members of the same species have similar resource requirements. Limited resources such as space, nutrients, water, and light in the case of plants help to keep population sizes steady. The more dense a population becomes, the more resources must be available to support it. There are two types of competition that take place between members of the same species or members of different species. These are known as indirect or scramble competition and direct or contest competition. During indirect competition, individuals independently seek resources without interacting with one another directly. An example would be that gypsy moth caterpillars that hatch from eggs laid on tree trunks crawl up to feed on the same leaves on the same tree. While the caterpillars are competing for the same food source, they are doing so without directly interacting with one another. During direct competition, individuals interact directly to gain access to resources. Examples would be territorial animal species defending an area to protect either food sources or offspring, for instance. As we know, the death rate of a population has a profound effect on how rapidly the population can grow. However, the death rate within a population may differ among individuals of different ages. What this means is that the survivorship varies with age. We can use a survivorship curve that shows the likelihood that an individual will survive to a given age. There are three types of survivorship curves known as late loss, early loss, and constant loss. In late loss populations, most individuals survive to old age. An example is humans, in which most of us are expected to reach a certain age into adulthood. For instance, it is much more common to hear about an 80-year-old dying than a 5-year-old dying. Early loss populations are the exact opposite in that there is a very high death rate among juveniles. Examples include fish and insects, in which many offspring are produced at once but receive no parental care. Therefore, many of the fish and insects are eaten as juveniles. In a constant loss population, there is a relatively constant death rate, no matter what the age is. An example is birds, in which the death rate is relatively constant due to predation, lack of resources, or even human factors such as flying into cars, windows, or airplanes. In this survivorship curve graph, the horizontal axis shows percentage of lifespan rather than age, so that species with different lifespans can be shown on a single graph. Type 1 refers to late loss, and the example is humans, in which the death rate spikes at a later age. Type 2 refers to constant loss. The example is birds, in which the death rate is relatively constant, regardless of the age. Type 3 is early loss. In this example, we look at trees, because many seeds that are spread from trees do not sprout properly. Therefore, they never grow into plants or trees to begin with. As we discuss regulations on population size, it is important to realize that humans are the only species on Earth that is in a pattern of exponential growth, which refers to a pattern of continuously accelerating increase in population size. It's estimated that the human population grows by about 1.2% per year. The human species is able to grow exponentially because we are able to overcome many environmental resistances, such as limited space and food resources. For instance, if we need more space, we can destroy other species' habitats. If we need more food, we can plant more crops or raise more farm animals. Human population growth since 1000 AD is exponential, as represented by the dark blue line. Notice that while the population in Asia, represented by the yellow line, which has many economically underdeveloped countries, is increasing exponentially, the population in Europe, represented by the light blue line, where most of the countries are economically developed, is growing much more slowly.